Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Antonio Andreoni. I have the pleasure today to chair this session. This is the last seminar of our IIPP Research Seminar Series. And today we are particularly pleased to have a colleague, a friend visiting the Institute and giving us some of his last research and work on a very important topic, which, of course, he's been working on for quite some time. Professor Pedro Rossi is going to give, as usual, a 35 minutes presentation. And we're also pleased that we are going to have Dr. Kate Roll from IIPP acting as a discussant today for our seminar. We have a few people joining online, and we have a group here at IIPP already in the room. So I will try to just introduce Pedro and wait until people get join us. The event, as usual, will be recorded, so everyone who could not attend also has the chance to watch it in the YouTube channel of the Institute. So Pedro is at Unicamp, one of the most interesting places in Brazil, where there is a long tradition of course, heterodox and pluralist economic thinking. He's an associate professor there, and he's been working and specializing on the macroeconomic and fiscal issues in the context of Brazilian economy, and of course the impact of fiscal policy in the context of social, environmental, and other important areas. He's been also a distinct professor at Fudan University and also a research fellow at UNCTAD. And he's also been very active, of course, in the Brazilian political debate, one of the economists working in the different groups advising the Lula presidential candidate for the next election, soon running election. So we are particularly pleased to have you here, and of course, his presentation is very much connected to one of the key topic of the IIPP in terms of mission and mission-oriented policy. So without further ado, the floor is yours, and thanks for being with us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I'll try to present here. Well, thank you for this very nice presentation. Yes, Unicamp is one of the most interesting places in Brazil. We do have the Economic Institute is basically heterodox. It's basically oriented to development, discussion. And our research is very policy-oriented. So there's much in common with you, and I hope this presentation can be a first step for the cooperations, and we can think other kinds of, and we may have you in Brazil, it will be our pleasure. So this presentation has some background. Actually, I'm gonna present basically this paper that was published as a discussion paper in a huge initiative called Principle for Human Rights in Fiscal Policy, led by several human rights institutions in Latin America and the US. And we have this big umbrella that we summarize these several issues about the questions. And before that, we had a huge discussion in Brazil about the issue of fiscal policy, and we have these 4 books that we published since 2016, which is the first one, which was very oriented to the debate in Brazil with the changing of the fiscal system that we had with an amendment. So we did this work that was basically a collective work with a lot of economists and other social scientists to measure the impact of austerity, to debunk the austerity myths, and to look forward. So in this way, these 4 books, the first one, 2016, the last one, I have one here, and I will give it to you guys if by any chance anyone is interested and can speak Portuguese. I'm sorry for that. And we went from anti-austerity discourse to a human rights-based proposal to guide the economy. So this is the background of this research. As you see, it's a very policy-oriented research, but also we went through deep into theoretical questions that I'm gonna try to show you here. So this is the outline. 4 basic things I want to talk here. The first is about why to talk about human rights and why to bring this issue to the spotlight. The second one is the relation between human rights and neoclassical theory. Here, I think this is a very interesting topic because there is a problem. There is really a problem between those two things. The third one is the relations between fiscal policy, human rights, and inequality. So inequality has a lot of studies in economic human rights with this approach, very few. And to finish the presentation, a mission-oriented fiscal policy for the fulfillment of human rights. So this is are the 4 points I'm going to bring here for the debate. And I start with this very basic question. So why talk about human rights? First of all, there is everything to do. So you need resources to fulfill human rights, almost every human rights. You have some that you need less, like the freedom of speech, some civil rights, but especially economic and social and cultural rights need resources. So on the other hand, human rights can be or should be a moral parameter for the organization of the economy. So it can be a purpose to guide policy, to guide missions, and to organize the economy. And more than that, it can be a way to challenge neoclassical economics. Because if it is a widely accepted language, which more than a language, it has some normative instruments, it has some, so the countries just signed tracts about human rights, so you have all this law side of the question. And you can challenge why neoclassical economics can't put in their models human rights properly. So this is one of the things. So the answer to the question is it is a moral parameter to organize the economy, very well accepted. It is an instrument to connect economics with social movements and organization, because I think since the 2008 crisis, a lot of human rights organizations, they saw that they have to study economics. If not, they can't understand the issues they are dealing with. So a lot of them came to us, so we can talk about, like in Brazil, the austerity measures were a starting point where social organizations just try to understand what's going on. If we have or we don't have money, how can we deal with this macroeconomic issue? So it's a way to dialogue with social movements and organization of several issues. And the third point is a way to challenge neoclassical economics. So that's why we are talking about human rights. And it's an issue that in economics, there are almost no studies that brings this issue like this human rights thing to the spotlight. In law, there are several studies, but not in economics, there are very few. So, and this is a summary of what we are discussing in the paper about this conflict between human rights and orthodox economics. First of all, the approach are completely different. Human rights is a normative approach. So you have to fulfill human rights. Orthodox economy, it's a positive approach. And the social purpose of both are very distinct. So in orthodox economic, you have this objective, this social purpose of maximizing social utility. So the rest is a consequences of the maximization of social utility. And human rights, you have these several rights which cannot be compared. All of them are important in the same way, and you have to fulfill all of them. So it's a multiple or multifold social purpose. And the social welfare idea behind the two approaches. So one orthodox economy, it's a result of an efficient allocation of resources. And the human rights approach is something that you have built politically. So to fulfill human rights, it's something that need action, need people, need policies. And for orthodox economics, it's not even a question. It's a result of an efficient economy. And sometimes there are contradictions. You can have an equilibrium of Pareto efficiency, for example, in housing markets where you have 10 million people homeless. So you can, because you are looking at individual choices restricted by a budget constraint. And when we think about human rights, we are thinking about a social choice. So there are things completely different. You can have a pension reform that supposedly brings more efficiency for the system, but violate human rights. Actually, to transfer money for people that doesn't work is not very efficient, but it may be fair. It may be a matter of justice. So in one approach, you cannot deal very well with this. In the other, you have to deal. So it doesn't say that you don't have, with this orthodox approach, a lot of very interesting researchers, very left-wing people working with the orthodoxy, that there are these orthodox instruments. But I mean, there is an incompatibility. You can defend like public spending in education, but it's not a matter of right. It's not a matter of value judgment. It's always a matter of utility, of externality. So what we are arguing here, that we have to bring back moral to the economic thing. We have to bring back value of judgment. It's not a neutral science, and it's not supposed to be. Even orthodoxy, we think it has some moral side, which is the utilitarian philosophy. They don't admit it, but it is there. So when they study, for example, discrimination or racism, racism is always a problem of the individual, not a problem of the structure. So, and you can solve it. It's a market failure. You can solve it by promoting competition in the market. So it's really a methodological instrument that has problems to deal with human rights, and sometimes it has its contradictions. So, actually, there is a competition between human rights and this utilitarian economic efficiency. So there is a little example here. An orthodox, politically liberal economist do not accept the use of torture to achieve a national security objective. This is because torture is the violation of the right to be free from cruel and inhuman treatment. It's a negative right. It's the one that you don't need to take action. You just have to be inactive. A negative right is you can fulfill by not doing something. So you have the freedom of religion. I'm not doing nothing, and you have your freedom. This one doesn't need much resources. That's why the orthodoxy deals better with this one. And there is the positive rights that you have to act. So someone has the right to health. So we have to manage resources to give this person the right to health. So the positive rights are more difficult to be applied in neoclassical model, because on the other hand, it's more acceptable to them to violate rights for a fair play or a decent job or decent working conditions because of efficiency. In the name of efficiency, you can accept the violation of rights. So, and there is this important rights that links all the discussion we do with the Keynesian macroeconomic and to stabilize an unstable economy, to promote full employment, which is the right to work. Unemployment is a waste of resources, but it is also a violation of the right to work. So if we think that way, we can bring to fiscal policy and to the duties of the government all the full employment policies justifying by the right to work. And we can challenge orthodoxy once more, because it's incompatible with this natural rate of employment, even if in the long run, these policies would lead to full employment in the way that there is a violation of the right to work. So we are not accomplishing the duty to give people work. So here we can bring all this discussion about macroeconomic and full employment. And here it's once more a summary of this discussion that we made. In the paper is about 6, 7, 8 pages about this discussion, which is the relation between the things, human rights, fiscal policy, and inequality. There's always a two sides, because one things affect the other, and human rights should be a base for leading fiscal policy, and human rights is always affected by fiscal policy. As inequality should be a base to think fiscal policy. All kinds of inequality. You can put gender inequality, racial inequality to think fiscal policy. Because fiscal policy is always a matter of inequality. There's no public spending or public taxation that is absolutely neutral in terms of inequality. We can think something close to neutral, like a vaccination campaign, which benefits almost everyone. But if I build a bridge, I will benefit more the people that goes around the bridge or that consume the products and services that pass through this bridge. If I transfer money from younger to older people, I'm benefiting more the oldest. From rich to poor, I'm benefit more. So fiscal policy is a matter of inequality. So we have to always think fiscal policy in this way. But human rights and inequality is not the same thing. There's a lot of work on inequality, but we can have human rights contributing to this thing, because inequality is a relative thing. So we always compare. Human rights, it's absolute. This person has or doesn't have the access to health, to education. Is or isn't poor. So poorness is an absolute concept. It's different from inequality. So you can have situations that you can reduce inequality, for example, income inequality, but you don't get better human rights conditions. When you commoditize the access to health, to education. So there are basically two different things. Of course, they are almost related, because when you have the violation of a human right, you have also a matter of inequality. If someone has access, the other doesn't have. So this is inequality. But there are two different things that we can work together, but we have to highlight also this discussion of human rights, and not only inequality, because there's a lot of work on inequality and few works on these human rights. So there's more to say about this, but I'd like to move forward to this discussion on a mission-oriented fiscal policy for human rights. And we summarize this way. I don't know if it's the better way to summarize, but a fiscal policy to promote human rights has to be guided by these 3 pillars. The first thing is to respect human rights principles and consider their guidelines. And a lot of them, these principles and guidelines, are already there. There are laws that have to be enforced. And some of them also are summarized in this table, which is a result from this initiative that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation. It's basically, you have these human rights principles that you can use it in fiscal policy. First, you have to have the basic. It makes no sense to have people starving. No sense. So if there is this problem, immediately you have the fiscal policy has a duty to manage resources to deal with this problem. So it's the minimum existential principle that we talked in the law debate. You have to have a progressive realization of rights. So you manage to fulfill the rights. So as you grow, as you organize the economy, but you can't go backwards. So it makes no sense that, for example, in Brazil, we have this deforestation that was being reduced, and then after 2016, it went up. And at the same time, you have to manage resources so that you can't go backwards. It makes no sense to, for example, child mortality to go up like it did in Brazil. So you are just being irresponsible with fiscal policy if this happens. You are being irresponsible by managing your policy if this happens. So there are a lot of principles that you can apply to fiscal policy. The non-discrimination, transparency, social participation. A lot of them are discussed, are very well established, and we can just bring to fiscal policy because the guy that is implementing fiscal policy just doesn't know this debate. And the second thing here that we point as a pillar is to be guided by well-defined social and environmental missions. And here we dialogue a lot with Mariana's work, with the discussion about this mission-oriented approach. So we really believe it. We think it can help. We think it gives us a purpose, a direction, and we can organize. And in a country like Brazil, we can do it with a very strong argument, which is we have to improve social conditions. So if we're talking about this human rights-based economy, we have to improve health, we have to improve education, we have to give food to people. So, and this can orientate a fiscal policy, but not only, fiscal policy is a part of this guided mission. Like here, I have this health example. Actually, I'm working together with Fiocruz, if you know, and Carlos Gadelha and others. Here, for example, you have this this health issue that is summarized here. This is another work, but I just brought here because we are working with the macroeconomic of health. So if we want to improve health in Brazil, it's not only fiscal policy. I mean, even we can spend more with health, with public health, but we can have problems with this. Why? Because a lot of the health inputs for the Brazilian universal system of health are from abroad. So we have a lot of imports, and to work with this fiscal policy oriented by health and other social issues, we have to have other policies like the trade policy, credit policy, import substitution policy. Like here, we are dealing with the final demand. So the demand, the social demand guides growth. This is a basic thing that we do. And this social demand on health, on sanitation, on housing, on education can drive growth, employment, technology, and industrial improvements. So we have to do import substitution if we want to have a sovereign and national health system. So, and these things come all together. So when we talk about mission-oriented fiscal policy, we are talking, as you do, as a mission-oriented strategy for development, where fiscal policy, and I know your work with Skidelsky, your article that you did.
Right. But unfortunately, I now have to go upstairs for the UN Habitat meeting. But the reason I'm so keen on what you're talking about, sorry if I'm interrupting, is we're not going to work with mayors. about bringing the human rights approach with the mission-oriented approach on housing. And I don't know if you know Leilani Fati. She's the UN rapporteur for housing, and she's one of the biggest advocates for the human rights approach as a mode of accountability for all policies. So we're going to talk about that later. with you. I'll see you at 6:30.
See you later.
Yes, sorry.
Thank you. And this is one example that we are working. Actually, we have this research group, and what I'm presenting is a kind of umbrella. But there are people working with gender, people working with race issues, people working with education and health. So this umbrella can applies to several issues. This is the health one where we manage to put all things together. Just to say that when we think about the fiscal policy, we are thinking also a bigger development strategy. And just to end this presentation, I'm going to say something about this fiscal responsibility. So what are the limits for a fiscal policy oriented to realize, to fulfill fiscal rights? And here I'm very radical in this issue, because I really think that the internal limits are not huge for a place like Brazil. The limits are external. So we can manage to have resources. So what is fiscal policy? Fiscal policy is not personal finance. Personal finance, you have your budget and you just have your decision. Fiscal policy about managing the resource that you have in a domestic, in a country, and you can do it with a place like Brazil. You can do it. I mean, the problem is when you have external constraints. So if you have an excess of imports, you have to do these import substitutions. So if you think fiscal sustainability, as we say, which is commonly associated with this public debt stabilization in the literature, but is also something that a concept that you can say, but fiscal sustainability is something that, well, the state is able or is unable to continue practicing fiscal policy. So in this way, you can do it like, if you're not constrained by external debt, you can do fiscal policy. If you're not constrained by capital flies, or your economy is not destabilized by this fiscal policy, you can continue doing fiscal policy. So what we're talking here, but when we say that fiscal responsibility has to do with this social responsibility, they are things together. We are saying that social responsibility is something that is constituent of fiscal responsibility. And if you do a fiscal policy, like in Brazil we do, that just look for stabilizing debt or stabilizing fiscal deficit, without looking to unemployment or to social issues, to human rights, this is not responsible. This is irresponsible policy. So when we talk about fiscal responsibility, we have to manage that the goal of the fiscal policy is also to fulfill human rights. So in this way, we redefine this concept of fiscal responsibility, saying that the objective, the goal, the purpose of fiscal policy is to help to realize, to fulfill human rights. And if you just turn your back for, like in Brazil, 30 million people starving, 20 million unemployed or sub-employed. So this is not a responsible fiscal policy. So we have to manage to allocate resources to have this economy put in place to fulfill human rights. And I think that there's a lot more to say, but I want to hear you about it. And this is health in Brazil. Like the demand for health final products is around almost 10% of GDP. It's huge. You can grow, you can generate jobs, you can generate technology. And then the other one is the challenge, because you have this trade balance of health, which has a lot of imports and growing imports. So this is the message I wanted to bring to you, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Pedro. This is a very interesting presentation, and of course we will be very keen also to engage with the audience. So feel free to join us in the discussion, raising your hands, and we will try to get you into promoting to the room to join the discussion. And of course, I guess this kind of presentation can be addressed from many different angles. Right? We could spend the rest of the day talking about theory of justice and back roads to Amartya Sen and Nussbaum, and how these things have been with us for a long time, as much as the economics of that, right? So of course we know that governments, we can be told they're not responsible, but there are lots of irresponsible governments who remain responsible. So what is the political economy of these propositions, right? And it's difficult to get that without discussing directly that. So I'm very keen to get to this conversation. Before that, we're very lucky to have Kate Rowe, a political scientist here at IIPP, who will kick off the discussion with some remarks. I see also Devon Silvers, some of our students, colleagues here, and so I'm very looking forward to move on with the discussion. Kate, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much. I'll put on my video so that I'm visible in multiple planes. So first of all, really, really nice to read this paper, really nice to hear your presentation. I'm very sympathetic to some of the questions and conflicts that you're raising and the discussion. As you might know, IIPP worked on a project around SDGs and tax. So covering some very similar terrain and some similar sort of conflicts and thinking. So it was nice to see that and a lot of echoes of that work. I think my comments I'm going to sort of organize in 3 different ways. I think the first is as if I was reading this as a journal article, particularly with my hat on as a political scientist, and questions about sort of theory, and then questions about the politics or political economy, which Antonio just raised. And then maybe the third way I'll sort of respond to the papers is sort of practice, policy side of things. So I think my first point on the theory is some questions around how you're theorizing or talking about orthodox economics in the paper, and particularly how you're talking about human rights in the paper. One of my notes said, buying into the BS ? And I think that there was some points in the paper where you seem to let there be a dichotomy between normative human rights and non-normative heterodox economics. And let's reject that. Let's push back against that, because being utility maximizing is highly normative, is an extremely normative way to organize it. It's a value-laden proposition. And so if we sort of say markets are natural and human rights are societal, then we're like already lost the game, right? So I think this, we really need to think about markets and orthodox economics as being highly normative, also potentially masking certain interests, and also thinking about their economic policies that are neoliberal, but not necessarily orthodox. And I'm not a great expert in this area, so others can maybe help me out more, but things like IP protections might be something that we think about as being, sort of messing with markets in certain ways that maybe some orthodox folks wouldn't like. I think maybe the other piece to that, and I think you did do this, but really to historicize, think about the context of these orthodox thinking, and really, again, remind the reader that these are highly normative and come with a whole history and politics to them. And I think that's a very similar idea that I saw in the treatment of human rights. The paper didn't problematize human rights at all. It didn't talk about questions about universality or controversies around them. And I think the other thing that was missing in the discussion of human rights was very much that historicization And you set them up as being highly in conflict. But I think like a feminist critique of human rights would say, no, 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 these are both grown out of the same Western liberal soil. That human rights, that traces back to some quite similar thinking of where we see liberal economics and enlightenment thinking. So, these might be sort of sisters and brothers separated at birth and have very strong focus on individuals, for examples, in a way that actually aren't in conflict. And so I think, leaning into some of that complexity, I think actually might enrich the paper. Again, I'm not a feminist theorist, but I think that feminist critiques of human rights, so contrasting it with care or community, may also be really interesting. And there's also such a strong feminist economics critique, which might also be sort of an interesting sort of bridge or third voice to bring in. But there's obviously others, whether it's around indigenous notions or ecological economics, or some of these other sort of super heterodox pluralistic kind of ways of thinking. Let's see. So those were sort of my, and I think tied into this sort of, we have this really strong dichotomy between, orthodox economics and human rights. We're always, we never really see truly free markets, right? So we're always in this, again, markets as politics, like seeing, we're always in these rule systems. We're always seeing norms. We're always seeing movement between, market redistribution and reciprocity, right? That's always happening. To go to Polanyi. Okay, so that's sort of my theory critique, and to think about, problematize and historicize both those ideas and look for that complexity rather than just having them in one versus the other. The second point is the sort of politics or political economy question. This is something that I very much relate to through the SDGs work. And so my question, if I was stepping outside and doing that kind of alienation that we sometimes do if we're studying politics, what work is saying we're going to use human rights here doing? What is that unlocking that other language couldn't unlock? And I think the SDGs are very similar, where people go, these are universally accepted, everyone has signed up, blah, 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 blah. You can't fight these, they're the good. And it allows us to push a lot of complexity under the rug and sort of say, like, you can't be against this. It's a really strong discourse. And it's important because you want that strong framing, that strong lever, I was pictures of Jedi's, the human rights versus the, you really want that. But I think if we step out from sort of a scholarly perspective, you say, oh, you're leveraging this kind of university language as an opposition to here. And I think we can critique that. And again, that might be a disincentive for why you're not engaging in some of the controversy and problems around human rights, because you need it to be this sort of oppositional force. So there's sort of a politics, political economy. What are you leveraging? And also when we get into this being adopted, what we see in the SDG space is that people say, we're doing the SDGs, and then they cram a lot of stuff that they were trying to do into that box. So is this, going to be used or captured to do other types of policies or things that were already in the pipeline? And then finally, on this sort of practice policy side of things, I think we end up in an issue with those recommendations where my note here was turtles on top of turtles on top of turtles. So you're saying to make something human rights aligned, it needs to be fair. Okay, what does it mean to be fair? Right, we end up in these sort of, well, it needs to respect people's rights. You almost end up in a tautological kind of loop around what's fair, what's right, because these are really difficult things to define and difficult things to bring into practice. So, how do we sort of land that plane and sort of saying, well, it should be fair, it should be rights aligned. I think that's a really tricky thing to do. And that's again where there's such an important thing about recontextualizing and say, what does that mean in Brazil? What does that mean to Brazilian people? What does that mean to the folks there? Final point on the sort of practice policy side, I think one thing that we really saw in the work with Spain is that a lot of tax principles are really important and very, very neutral, or set up as quite as neutral, again, to not fall into my own trap. You know, transparency, simplicity, some of these very classic ideas. And I think we've been trying to push some of the tax policy stuff, and where I see this project also going is that sort of directionality piece. You know, if you're really explicit about where you want a country to go or policy to go, and then you really explicitly, you know, use those tools to get you there, there's sort of a boldness that invites that I think is very key to how IIPP thinks about missions. And so, you know, some of the, you know, transparency, fairness, these kind of things feel more towards that traditional language around doing tax well. And there might be, you know, I maybe push you more to say, you know, what does this look like? If we are going to be directional around health and tax, what does that look like? How does that manifest? Because I think there's a lot of room and space for new thinking there. Because yeah, all the discussion of tax and SDGs, or 90% of it right now, is do we raise enough money to fund education, to fund health, to fund these things? So very similar to the rights space. And it's not saying how do we use these tools to push health, to push, you know, it's a slightly different orientation. It's not just you have the fiscal, the basis, the tax base to do it. So yeah, those are my comments. Really enjoyed this. I think, you know, you'll have a lot of people who are very sympathetic and like this work. And I think that's actually an invitation to make them more uncomfortable. Because I think everyone wants to be on the side of human rights and against orthodox economics, or at least around in this crowd. So I think you can actually probably trouble them more and problematize some of this stuff a little bit more, because otherwise we're just going to sit here and always be the good guys. But yeah, really, really nice work. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. That's very interesting. Several remarks. And, I will refrain myself from starting because I could capture the conversation. So I will be very keen. We will have time for discussion. We have a good time for discussion. I will give Pedro just literally 2-3 minutes just to react to anything specific you want to react, while anyone in the audience on Zoom who would like to join the discussion to start, please raise your hand. You will be promoted to the panel and we will be able to hear your comment, your question, and involved in the discussion. And also I will then invite colleagues here. So Damon already and Jose already raising their hands. So please, quick reaction, just to keep the roll going.
Yeah, the 3 comments that I capture here about the utilitarian approach that is very normative, and I do agree. The problem of human rights itself, like this very, I mean, complex thing that is human rights, and I think we can talk and expand this point of the discussion. And the political economy. And then I can talk a little bit about Brazil to say our context and how this kind of thing helped us. But I think that there are amazing points that you raised, and I think I can expand on this afterwards.
Excellent. We look forward, especially the political economy, that I push for it. If there is no raised hand, I'm looking at our excellent collaborator who is checking everything. I will just give a chance to Damon and Jose to raise your question, and Danielle, if they are pretty similar, we put them together, and then we have a chance to Pedro to the first round, and then we have another round. Please, Damon.
Thank you. I loved your presentation. I mean, I thought that it illuminated something very important in contemporary sort of political discourse, right? That there is a real problem between the popularity of human rights language and the popularity of neoliberal kinds of essentially utilitarian ways of talking about political decision making. This is a theme that I'm sort of embarrassed and written about seeing your work, but I think it's an extremely important thing to unpack. And I'm also very sympathetic with Kate's comments about sort of, you know, there's another layer of skepticism here that needs to be put on there. But I wanted to sort of challenge you in a somewhat different direction. If Kate is sort of saying, okay, like this contest between these two Western modes of discourse is not the whole world, right? I wanted to sort of push you a bit or challenge you a bit from within this box, right? And in the following way. I think one of the reasons for the enduring popularity of of utilitarian economism, right? Which no matter how many times, no matter how many catastrophes it brings on, and how many times it's discredited intellectually, it seems to bounce back, you know, like Dracula, right? Is because it gives political decision makers a simple metric, a way of making a decision, right, and a way of defending, and the challenge of now, you know, never mind that the analytics are often wrong, never mind that the question of how you define utility is a highly contested thing, right? If you do simple-minded, if you do sort of simple-minded and power-friendly in the sense of like, you make assumptions that people who have power will be happy with, right? If you like substituting money for utility, right? If you do these things, then you have a way of making a decision. The problem with the human rights frame, as you have articulated, it makes absolute claims, right? It takes things that are kind of negotiable in the utilitarian framework and turns them into absolute claims, right? If housing is a human right and somebody out there is homeless, then the first priority of the state at any cost would appear to be to house that person, right? How do you deal with the fact that that may not be possible? Or maybe that's not the highest priority? Or, you know, I mean, one can come up with a long set of lists about sort of the practicalities of decision making that the human rights frame doesn't appear to give you a way to answer, right? And that seems to me to be the challenge of the framework you are articulating, right? Is that the practical politician says, how do I actually govern? I'm sympathetic, but how do I do it?
And if I may add to that, how do we legitimize a certain human right vis-a-vis another?
Yeah, this is the
Because,
because,
you know, in this country, in the last century, Marx, you know, remembered that they told us that, you know, they were discussing kids should work 8 hours, 12 hours, or 16 hours. Today we don't discuss that anymore, right? So these are the historical processes that define what is a human right, what is not, right? And these are structurally determined in many ways, right? So you might have context where a politician needs to legitimize something that actually doesn't really fit with what people see in the reality of their experience. Okay. Sorry, I was supposed to shut up. Sorry.
Just one sentence on your point, though. John Rawls, you know, the liberal political philosopher, asserted that if we could take, you know, that we put ourselves in the original position, we would all agree on the liberal non-economic human rights. Right, that we would all agree we wanted freedom of speech and freedom of religion and so forth, right? And then he shifted to this kind of modified utilitarianism when it came to economics, right? Now, the question of why he didn't think that we would all in the original position want housing, right, or food, right, is one I don't think he had an answer to. I think it's a sort of a, you know, it was just sort of going with the flow in political philosophy, so to speak, right? But if you did that, how would you govern?
We'll go back to the
Yeah.
the idea of justice theory just later. Danielle and Jose, and then we.
Jose might want to go first because actually my comments are pretty similar, but I'll add to something because I thought his thoughts were very interesting. I mean, I'm not sure if I'm in the position to comment something, but I just wanted to ask. I mean, I thought it was super interesting. Thank you, Pedro. And I mean, I have tons of questions, but we can talk later. But I guess my question is exactly, I think, going following what it was asked before. what is exactly your difference of this human rights framework in comparison to other existing approaches in public policy with this idea of normative human rights and universal endowments? Because like taking like Ross's maximum, we want to improve the utility of the least worst individual. So how does that differ to what you're doing? The capabilities approach, how does that differ to what you're doing? Because so I do some work on the history of public economics and this interplay with political philosophy. And I think orthodoxy is much more heterogeneous than that, in the sense that they are moving away actually from max-u, from maximizing utility, and they are going into other ways to try to, I don't want to say incorporate exactly what the critics have talked about, but they try to promote certain ideas that still rely on this framework that underneath it is essentially market-based. It has the idea of the household as the analogy, like when you think the balanced budget idea. And they want to come to a final product that is measurable and it's an easy answer. So you want something that is easily quantified and easily absorbed in the public discourse. So yeah.
Excellent. You said, and then we will give it a chance to have the first round of reaction. And I also see there is a first question coming, so I will bring it together. Yeah.
Yeah, so it was perfect that you went first because I'm gonna go off topic completely. I'm gonna ask about something else.
If you don't mind, then it's completely different.
Yeah.
May I
This question is related, maybe I
suggest
can
that-
come back.
Yeah, let's pick up these two questions because you have a chance to give a more coherent answer, and then we go to the second.
We have Kate's question too. So it's not just two questions.
I was reinforcing part of their question.
So may I?
Yeah, please.
Okay, great. No, I think the questions are very interesting, very challenging, and I don't know if I can answer them, but I'm sure I'm going to think about them for some time. But just to give you a quick answer, a first answer, starting with this Kate's question about. I agree with you. It's very normative, the utilitarian approach, but it doesn't present himself as a normative methodology. So yes, we have to unmask this approach. It's like, I mean, it's a social choice based on this utilitarian philosophy. So we have to put it in a way that they tell themselves as non-normative, just positive, and neutral science. Economics is just for doing the calculation, so that the society decides what to do, but it's always in the direction of this utilitarian approach. So I agree with you, and I think this has to be written down. The problem with human rights, and then I think you're right too, I really don't agree with this empty discourse of human rights. Everyone talks about human rights, but usually looking more at the negative rights, not so much at the positive rights. So they accept human rights, but not so much, you know? And I really think we have to deal with this. I really have a Marxist view of the economy, but I think I can handle with human rights too, in a way that you can redefine what we are talking about. So we can talk about collective rights, human rights. We can think about, and in this way we can think about an egalitarian society with a democracy that goes from bottom down into the government. But I really think we have to think more about this. We were in this conference that there was a discussion about green growth and degrowth and a society without money. I think the way for a society without money is first to organize the economy so people can have access to what they need. So if I have food, if I have health, if I have education, or free or universal, you can take money out, but not before this. You cannot just go back for something that is pre-capitalist. That was the discussion. I forgot her name. Very interesting scholar. that presented about no money society and a degrowth society. In this framework, there's no room for degrowth. There's room for a different growth with a different quality. And when it comes here to this theoretical approach, I really think, Daniele, that we have to put these things together. And I think the problem, I didn't explore much of this other approach inside orthodoxy, but I think the problem is with the individual methodology. So this is the problem. So if you can manage a little bit to have the capability approach or to go to the other side, things get a little bit better, but you still have a problem. So I really think about this, but I have to go deep.
Yeah, that is the critique of Sen, that it still sits with the individual
Yeah.
and ignores sort of community or community or anything like that.
So there has been a big debate on this, right? So we should also not reinvent the wheel, right?
Mm.
In the development discourse for 25 years, it is not the case that the capability approach which informed Human Development Index, more human rights that you cannot go, until 2011, it didn't have any measure of inequality because it was an individualistic framework. It has no measure about collective freedoms because Sam has always implied, where do you stop, right?
Yeah.
When the collective becomes a negation of individual freedom, right? So the fundamental liberal position, it's incompatible with what you are saying.
That's
This
the
is the
point.
problem. So say we don't believe in liberal thinking or liberal type. We have to be explicit about it and propose something that is affirmative because we don't exit from that story otherwise.
That's right. Yeah.
And that's what I meant about them being sort of siblings separated in the cradle, that, they're both coming out of highly liberal frameworks, right? And so they're sort of saying that they're in conflict to some degree, sure, but in other areas very much have, an individual view of society and have that same issue.
Yes. And when I talk about orthodoxy, I didn't define it. Orthodoxy, it's neoclassical economics, right? Which is the most dominant school of thought, neoclassical economics. If you take mainstream, there are other approaches that we can maybe see that is a little bit different. I'm talking about neoclassical economics. And if you think about neoliberal policy, I think this is wider. And I think a great part of our society is not of this organized by this utilitarian approach, but more than the liberal Austrian one. And if you take Hayek, he's more honest in what he's saying. I mean, he's saying no, that there is judge of value judgment. I'm against human rights. And he said there are several quotes that we had in the paper that Hayek going against human rights when that was a time of human rights declaration. He was saying that this is a communist thing that will go to. I mean, so in the Austrian way of thinking, the society, there is a problem, and they say there is a problem. But the thing is, in the neoclassical economics, they say there's no problem with this, but there is a problem.
I wonder, like you picked this looking at the orthodox view, in some ways it'd be interesting to engage with, like if you're saying that, if the orthodox view isn't actually what we're seeing in practice, we're seeing much more of a neoliberal view or a mix, then like that's maybe the interesting place to look for conflict still, rather than fishing to the extremes. Because there's always this movement between what's seen as in the market and what's seen as not. Child labor, we don't see that as acceptable. That's not even a discussion anymore, whereas that would have been a discussion before and would have been on the table. So yes,
this brings us to the political economy question, which is very challenging. And well, what we had in Brazil, for example, it was we were the worst place in the world. I mean, there were several reforms, one after the other, and we are just fighting, struggling, and they just went on. And in our fight, in our struggle, the argument was always the same. This reform will improve confidence, will bring efficiency, which will bring employment and growth. And then the reform was implemented, and there was no growth, no employment. But we need another reform, and this reform will bring efficiency. So it is this argument. So what we are trying to do with these books I show is to tell that this is basically a lie. So we were confronting their position that were mainly mainstream economists, but orthodox economists, orthodox argument, with our arguments against them. So, and more of this, when we dialogue, and this brings me to the importance of this approach in a political economy way. When we dialogue with the judicial system, there was the judge that was there, having to judge if it is constitutional or not unconstitutional to just cut the funding of the health system, for example. And there was a orthodox economist that was just saying there's no money, there's nothing to do, we have to cut, and this is better for the system because of the employment, because of the confidence in that. And there was us that was trying to say the other thing, you know, it's unconstitutional. Your people are dying, so you cannot cut funding. So you see that there is this two approach, and this language about human rights, the judge knows, you know, because this is about law. And when we put together law and economics, it makes sense, you know, and it makes sense to the human rights movement, the several organizations. So it makes sense for them. So you are talking about macroeconomics to a gender movement organization, to this racial movement that we have in Brazil, which is huge. So you are bringing things and saying they are related. So I think this is telling you that the approach is quite, at least in Brazil. We were at the beginning, we were not talking much about human rights, because in our constitution there is social rights. We are always talking about social rights. I still talk more in Brazil about social rights than human rights, because the constitution text is about this. But it is an approach that it helped us in the debate. So, and it helped us to challenge our students. I mean, he has a language very good, very nice model, but there are some problems. And when we challenge the orthodoxy in this way, it's difficult. Sometimes I put in the Twitter and I mean, people study this for decades. And then someone says, no, this is a wrong approach. You are against human rights, or this is, it's not very nice to hear. But it's a way to, I mean, to challenge.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's why I think this is important. And to end this, I just need to answer this, because I really think it's an important question. Yes, there are absolute claims. Some of them are really difficult to realize. And there is this concept in human rights that human rights have to be progressively fulfilled. Some of them, we just have to manage resources now. Like the case of Brazil, we had a situation where there was zero hungry. There was Lula's government. Now we have 30 million people. This is easy. It's small money. You can do it. And you have to do it. There are resources. You have to do it. You can do it. About housing, it's more complex, but you have to do it progressively. So, of course, there is a way you can do it more radically or more slowly. So, there is always this kind of problem. That, it is an approach that can push a government to some quick reaction, or can give a way to it. When we talk about missions, we can think of what we want for our health system in 5 years, in 10 years. And we have quantitative indicators that are the goals. So what we need to achieve? We need public resources, we need investment, we need industrial policy, we need trade policy, what we need to have this done. For health, for education, for sanitation, for housing. So this is the mission approach. So you can have it achieved progressively.
You want to have 30 seconds, 30 seconds, and then I will go. What next?
Other people want to speak.
Yeah, next one. Okay, there is a question from Paulo Fernandez. I can, if he's not getting into the room, I'll read the question. He says, there are many criticisms on how some governments are dealing with inflation today. Which policies could be implemented to deal with high inflation following the human rights approach? And you said you'd like to.
Yes, I mean, mine could be tangentially, very tangentially related to this issue of inflation. So I really liked how you spoke. You made reference to the foreign constraint that is pervasive in Latin American economy, right? I think that's a very interesting thing because it puts you in a little bit of a conundrum. I mean, nowadays we kind of like agree that industrial policy is a very important thing to do to promote growth and to perhaps guarantee human rights. But you know, given that in our economies we have high levels of foreign debt, that imposes constraints into the ability of governments to spend money, and it gets you in a problem because we sort of like agree that industrial policy is important, but the way we've been talking about industrial policy so far is we need to spend more money, public money in innovation, in R&D, in strategic sectors, provide subsidies, and so on and so forth, which we don't have because of the foreign constraint. So the foreign constraint doesn't let us get out of the foreign constraint category. You referenced import substitution, and that is what I'm interested in, what your thoughts are. I think we've been talking a lot about industrial policy, but we haven't really talked narrowly about the mechanisms or the policy tools industrial policy have used in the past. Latin America relied heavily on import substitution based on strategic use of tariffs, and even though neoliberalism is fading away, the tariff, like the zero tariff regimes or the free trade agreements are pervasive, are something that's stuck. So the only one that I recall being renegotiated was the NAFTA between Mexico and the United States recently. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about using tariff, what are the uses of tariffs in that context, and if you have any thoughts about there's a lot of literature that has sort of like established that, established that they failed in Latin America. Maybe you have some thoughts about why did that happen? How can they be used differently and so on?
Very nice.
Excellent. Okay, I don't see other questions here. So would you like to address these two questions, and then we go back to the other questions in the audience, and I will take the freedom to also ask a question, please.
Thank you. I'll start with Jose's question. Well, I think this is a very interesting question. I think I have no direct answer to it, but I will talk a little bit about what I think about industrial policy, because I really think we have to redefine what this old-fashioned industrial policy was in Latin America and rethink it. And rethink it in this framework. Before talking about the human rights base, we were talking about the social demand-led economy, where industrial policy helps this social areas. So in some ways, we were criticizing some of the policies that were in place in Lula's government. Some people didn't like it very much. These things about the national champions, your friend, Luciano Coutinho, which is my friend as well. Your friend, my friend too.
It's all our friends.
I don't know.
We wrote a small article that was called "The Left Had to Rethink the Idea of Industrialization." And there was a lot of people that just called me, "What are you talking about?"
Tell us what you're talking about.
We were talking about something that industrial policy had to make sense in the social way. I mean, there's no purpose of having, for example, pursuing something like this is a strategic area. We're gonna invest in this, and that you put money on it, and you have this production in this area, this technology, and then it's sold for the farmer. And then this technology doesn't go down to the society, to the so what we are talking about, that if you have a clear goal, the health system needs a lot of industrial policy, a lot of, because it's intensive in technology, in employments, in capital. So if you have this health system, you can think about industrial policy as a means to this end, to improve the health system. And the sanitation, you have to have some technology, and to the urban transport, and so you can have industrial policy directed to these social goals, you see? And doing that, you democratize social policy. You can put the population to think about it. This money that is coming from the government or this bank, BNDES, for example, it's helping the system to provide me services. So I'm going to look up for this money. I know this is a good thing. Of course, there are industrial policies that are important for general things. You have Petrobras, you have the energy side, you have a lot of things. But you can think industrial policy. It's not against. Rethink industrialization is to put industrialization where it has to be, as a mean, not as an end. Because this old-fashioned discourse in Latin America was, we have to industrialize. This is the goal. So, and this comes to these other tools that like tariffs and import substitution. Like I said, it's not the old-fashioned one, but I mean, the pandemic shows us that you have to have some strategic industrial sector. Is a kind of sovereignty. It's about having the ways to deal with a situation. And so sanitary sovereignty, and the last question you made, this foreign sovereignty, because I mean, Brazil has no foreign debt now, but other countries do. So there is a problem. Yeah, like Colombia, there is a problem. So how to deal with it? So tariffs are very important. So you can manage to say what is the priority, what it is not. But when you don't have this problem, so fiscal policy has more power to do it. Of course, in countries like other countries, it's more difficult. So this is what I think about this very interesting question. But I'm going to think more about this thing. And there is Paulo Fernandes' question about inflation. We just published a guide on inflation and human rights, monetary policy, inflation, and human rights. It's a very interesting, an illustrated guide with some drawings on it. It's very interesting. And this issue, it's also very nice to go through, because inflation is mainly a distributive problem. Sometimes we don't think this way, but inflation is something that just moves the economy and benefits some sectors to other sectors. So when you think inflation in this human rights perspective, you have to look to these baskets of things that poor people consume and find it as a priority. In the case of Brazil, for example, we have problem with fuel, like all of the world. We have a problem with food. Why do we have problem with food in Brazil? We are one of the most important countries producing food. So, and when we look to government policy, we look that they privatize the food stocks. We have an agency that regulates food stock and sells foods when the price is high and buys when the price is low. They privatize. So a way to fight inflation is to have these food stocks and the government buying and selling. This is one way. And the other way is by trying to manage the exchange rates so it's not so volatile like it is in Brazil. You have some types of capital flight, and then the exchange goes, and then it goes down. Another way is to, as we have Petrobras, which is this oil company that produces and that refines the oil. Yeah. We can manage to put prices stable, different from other countries that don't have this. So there are several ways to deal with inflation without just putting interest rate up, which is the worst case, because with interest rate up, you're just in a country which has a high unemployment, which is in a crisis for 5-6 years. You put interest rates up, you have more unemployment, you have more human rights problems. So to deal with inflation is like a box of instruments. If I want to do something, I have to take the specific instruments. It depends on the cost of the inflation. I take an instrument. It's not only one instrument that is the interest rate. So this is the way we approach this relation between human rights and inflation.
Thanks. I'm looking if there is, because we lost the connection here. It doesn't seem to be any other question in the audience, but I give the chance to them to bring in another comment and then we'll follow up on that.
Okay, thank you. So just in listening to the responses to the questions, a couple of things occurred to me. I think, which might be helpful to you. I think we actually have a lot of real-world cases of human rights being used in a variety of ways to structure public policy decision-making with economic consequences. I think there are sort of ways around the absolutist claims, right? Which are really the problem, right? The last thing any politician wants to hear is an absolutist claim, right? But there are ways around that have been used in different circumstances. There's also, I think, a conceptual issue here that you might benefit from highlighting. This whole discourse around what kinds of philosophical principles should motivate political and economic decision making has this concept of is it possible to define kind of process, is it possible to define processes independent of conceptions of the good, right? Human rights are asserting conceptions of the good. They expect that's what they're about. And in a way, they give meaning to utilitarian calculuses, right? There is a problem with the neoclassical view of the world, which is that it presents a false clarity, right? If you knew what constituted the utility, what is utility? My utility is the same as yours, right? The substitution of currency or capital for utility is a sleight of hand, right? Now, human rights thinking is a way of asserting a set of definitions of utility, right? If you understand utility properly. And I think it might be worth sort of bringing that out, that there's an incoherence in liberal theory without a better, a richer understanding of utility. And the human rights literature is a consideration of that over time through experience. Now, in terms of actually doing it, right, there are a number of instances that I'm aware of where human rights guarantees are written into law and thereby have to be interpreted, right, and have been interpreted. I think one of the most interesting ones from the perspective of what you're talking about is the USMCA, it's the rewrite of NAFTA, it's the tariff issue that you were talking about earlier, because labor rights are written into that, right? They're written into it in a fairly absolutist way, right? Now, it's new, it's a young agreement, and what that means is being fought over every day. But there you have a major trade agreement that has a human rights component right in the center, in a highly actionable way. Secondly, and you were talking about this in the context of healthcare and housing, but in the United States, this issue has been litigated in the context of education on a number of occasions, where there are state constitutions that have education as a right, right? So that the state constitution says everyone has a right to an education. Well, it turns out, of course, that legislatures don't always actually implement that. right? Or they implement it in ways that are clearly inadequate. And people go to court and said, well, hey, here's the Constitution, and said to a judge, you have to do something. And judges have then tried to figure out, all right, well, what level of spending per pupil constitutes an education? What level of discrimination, what level of racial or geographic discrimination constitutes depriving somebody of an education? And in the most extreme cases, they've ordered taxes to be raised, right? Rather than, and so I think there's a body of lived experience that you can draw upon to support your framework and say, actually, human rights are not unmanageably absolute, right? In fact, no legal guarantee is unmanageably absolute. They create a framework that then judges have to interpret and legislation to work with and so forth. But it is doable. It's not like it is doable. It's been done, and it's ultimately maybe no harder than anything else.
On that, maybe I can follow up on that. As a scholar of development, I'm very annoyed with voluntaristic approaches to development, right? Because fundamentally, there is an understanding of how development happens in the country can afford a conversation about rights, right? So there is a problem around how we manage to get to the point where in some countries, certain things have been written in the law and are enforceable. Because in Brazil, you can put it in the law, but if there is no way to enforce it, it's not political economy. Right. Well, we have a nice piece of paper which doesn't mean anything. Right? The majority of the world, that's what the US is moving towards an emerging countries. The dimensions of probably. Yes, but political economy is putting in that direction. But let's talk about the other more interesting emerging countries and countries in Latin America or in Africa. We need to face the reality of economies that are fundamentally structurally extremely vulnerable. Right? I completely share the starting point, right, around what we want to achieve. Right? We, by the way, we in this room, because the we doesn't mean anything in the political economy. In the political economy, there is no such a thing as we, right? We want this. What does it mean? This is our mission. We want you to have this mission. If we believe in authoritarian enlightened regime, and I believe that works. And actually, historically, has worked, by the way. There are lots of countries where they enforce human rights incrementally. Let's not forget the Millennium Development Goals were achieved because China has made a miracle in poverty reduction. Not in a liberal way. I mean, this is not about a moral judgment, it's how history has developed. Right? Now, I'm putting this in upfront because problematize what you are saying, especially in a context like Brazil, where I'm thinking about Chile, I'm thinking about Colombia. One thing is to win the election, another is to create a coalition that is willing to support certain type of progress. And I'm wondering if the human rights approach is the one that actually helps in that case. Or what is the other, that's where my question is going, right? What is the kind of way of framing the political economy of that change, right? That you want to have in place? Because actually someone could say, well, a human rights approach might work very well in a certain country that is already established, right? So you are not actually building a coalition, you're just putting a flag on top of a coalition that already exists. If it is sufficiently powerful, they might support actually someone in power, but then there is a moment where that person in power, and to translate that, I agree, I'm very sympathetic with Lula. Lula was in a very positive moment. There was a commodity boom, there was bonanza, and so on. Dilma struggled dramatically. Lula now is getting back, hopefully, in a context which is very different, right? Where these structural problems, you talked about the import substitution and so on, I think all of that cannot be addressed without a serious engagement with the political economy of that, and one other side of the picture, which is basically how you really, and in this case, I disagree with what you were saying, industrialization is a means to something, for sure. But this is also problematic, right? Because something that the old school understood is that industrialization is an end in itself because it transforms the society, right? Of course, you need to direct that. You need to find a way to create good jobs, to translate surplus generation into welfare provision and so on. So it's not it's an automatic process. But without that productive transformation, there is no progressive agenda. Right? And this is something that I think also the progressive camp need to come to a resolution of. Right? You talk with the Marxist of some degrowth argument. Well, working is a disutility. For me, working is not a disutility. For me, working is a right, and I'm scared to think about people without a job, right? This is not always, so within even the progressive camp, there is a sort of tendency to then push the human rights agenda in a direction that jumps 3 steps of development and becomes actually counterproductive more than actually support. So in that spectrum, we don't want to get into an Hayekian social change theory, but we don't want also to jump into the voluntaristic space where actually we become counterproductive to incremental change. And so that's my struggle in this kind of situation, because I think there is a bit of this element of how we, as much as Amartya Sen talks about capabilities sitting from getting a tea in a room in Harvard, Cambridge, Massachusetts, right? And elaborate, going back to Aristotle, how the process or the harmony of flourishing works and so on. It doesn't understand how that works in practice. The fact that lots of people in developing countries have access to form of provision through collective processes. There is no such a thing as a human right per se. They are part of communities that in some way have collective processes of provision, right? As much as we want to avoid that, we won't avoid us as a progressive academics sitting in another room and saying, we believe in these human rights and we will do this and we will do that, because clearly it doesn't reflect the reality of the political economy in these countries. And I think in that sense, we trying to find a way to make this agenda much more also related to production transformation with the old teams more than trying to, saying, oh, the old teams were not actually capturing the, I think would be an important one. I think your story around the health sector, it's particularly telling, because you're showing how the import, the dependency that sector, despite lots of institutions like your Klutz, Butantan and others that have been built with the old style process there, despite this institution, they are not able at the moment to have state capacity to actually translate that into complete, addressing that massive gap in the import of. Having said that, Brazil is probably one of the few cases where this institution still exists. So you're actually in the probably best position, right? They tried to dismantle Benedes and they realized that these people were ultimately not corrupted. You have institutions like Fiocruz who managed to scale up vaccine manufacturing to 200 million. So I think Brazil is a case for all, right? It's a positive case. But I think we need to find a way of creating a political economy of that. So my question is really, what is a feasible political economy of change for Brazil that you would put forward to Lula in the following election? Maybe you have a more specific question than mine.
No, actually, mine was like yours.
But it's a student right there.
Yes. No, because I was like, no, not when I ask this. This is like, but I mean, I made some notes here. I can answer the question because I was talking to you about the Brazil Forum, right? So 2 weeks ago, Jumala Conceição Pinto, she's the director of the Brazilian Independent Fiscal Institute. She said that the debate on fiscal and social responsibility, they must go hand in hand. And you mentioned this already. But in Brazil, fiscal rules have lost credibility, and we have like the teto fiscal. I think in English is spending cap. Well, it's already a problem. And there is a book that just came out that it says that because the spending cap, teto fiscal is linked to the Constitution, is in the Constitution. Just last year, it had 3 amendments and 177 changes in the budget, like only last year. So this is one of our biggest problems because the government can claim we don't look at the medium term or the long term, we only look at the short term. So how can we regain the planning and strategic planning capacity in Brazil in relation to the fiscal and social responsibility issues in the next 4 years if Lula gets elected? That was my question. Like, that's why I waited. I didn't want to.
So officially, the seminar is supposed to end at 6:30. I'll give you 5 minutes just
to deal with it.
just to address those. I see there are still people in the audience, and then we have a drink to continue this conversation. This is the beauty of being back to live seminars where people forget about sticking with time.
I'm very impressed with this debate because it's very challenging and you have a very practical way of thinking. And I think it really helps me to think things about. And yes, human rights is not something that you put in the paper and that's it. It's a social convention. So you have to have people that believe it. And more than this, you have to actually have some degree of equality. Because to to think someone has a right to something, you have to share something with this person. You have to be solidary. You have to think that this person is equal. In a place like Brazil, with this inequality that we have, this feeling is kind of lost. So I know that this approach is to pick up some elements. I'm bringing this approach to the Lula's campaign debate. And I know this will not go like this. But some elements, the mission-oriented approach, I think it will go on it. And some of the things that's not my contribution, but Lula's contribution. Lula has this kind of thing. When he says, we will end with hunger in Brazil. There's no more room for starvation in Brazil. This is an absolute thing. He said, I will do it. And he did it once, and he wants to do it again. So this is a human rights. He's putting his language, the language that all peoples understand, and he's bringing this approach. And he knows about this structural, because this thing we do here, I'm criticizing industrialization, but I take the whole structuralist approach to this view. There's nothing to do with a market saying this. I'm just bringing development issue with this structural view, considering that we do have to have the capacity to produce. Human rights have to have material base. If not, I cannot bring health to people. I cannot bring education. I cannot bring housing. I have to have this material base. So what I'm doing right here is just to put a hierarchy on it and saying this is very important to this goal, And I'm not criticizing. I think when I say old-fashioned industrial policy, I think that this was another context with other things. We have a lot of state-owned companies. We had capital controls. There was no like this neoliberal exchange rate crisis that we have today. So we have to rethink all of this. And we cannot build like a second revolution, typical industrial plans and industry that make no sense today. And some of the sectors, we won't compete with China or another country. So where we can go, and this is priority, like the health complex, industrial, economic complex is a priority. And we can do it. We can force it. The state have the power to buy things from the private sector, so we can manage to have this industrial policy successful. We can do it. We have technology, we can have employment, we can have growth based on this. So, and other sectors are the same, So this is another thing that I think it will go onto this program, the complex, economic and industrial complex of health. And I think because of the pandemic, the importance that the health has, the importance of SUS, which is our NHS that we have in Brazil. So just to brainstorm you about this, I think, yes, this approach is really an approach that has this difficulty in terms of the political economy, but it helped us a lot in our debates in Brazil. And I think it can help more. I think it can go and it can put in other ways of thinking about development in this global south perspective, thinking about external constraints. For me, external constraints is the point of development in the global south. It's not fiscal constraint, it's external constraint. So we have to deal with it with industrialization.
Yeah, but this industrialization is an internal constraint to the extent that no country, by definition, a developing country is a country where the power and the interest are not towards industrialization, but towards a relativistic position. So the external constraints are a major problem, but you have massive internal political economic constraints that are difficult to unlock simply stating what we want. We need to understand how we increment, because that's how development works. We cannot jump out that's my proposition.
Yeah, no, I think yes.
I think we are agreeing.
I don't even use the word development, because we are not going somewhere. We are underdeveloped. And we have to win this. This is a Furtado's term. We are not developing as we are going there to be developed. We are in another way. So this is this power relation with the global north. We are underdeveloped. And to win, to just put away under development, we have to build this capacity to be sovereign. And what we are saying here is not only to build this capacity to be sovereign, but to build in a way to fulfill human rights. So social demands are pushing this development.
Well, I think on this positive note, and we want to thank Pedro for this excellent discussion and animated this very good debate. Thanks for the people who have stayed with us until now. This will be on our YouTube channel, and with this we close this year seminar series. And thanks everyone for joining, and we will continue with the drink here, this conversation.
That's the best part.